The weight of service. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above Mel's diner, casting their harsh glow across the worn linoleum and cracked vinyl booths that had seen better decades. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, that dead zone between the lunch rush and the early dinner crowd, when the restaurant held its breath and the staff caught theirs. Maria Santos balanced the heavy tray against her hip, her left arm throbbing beneath the white cast that ran from her wrist to her elbow. 6 weeks now since the accident, and still 3 more to go before the doctor would even consider removing it. She'd gotten good at compensating, developing a careful dance of weight distribution and precise movements that kept the plates steady and the customers none the wiser. Most of the customers, anyway. At booth 7, the man in the gray sweater watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He'd been coming in for 2 weeks now, always alone, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and apple pie, and always watching. Watching the way she struggled with the heavy trays. Watching her wince when she thought nobody was looking. Watching her force that smile that had become as much a part of her uniform as the powder blue dress and white apron. What Maria didn't know was that David Kellerman owned the place. David had inherited Mel's diner from his uncle 3 months ago, along with a portfolio of 12 other restaurants scattered across the Midwest. Uncle Mel had been old school, the kind of man who knew every employee's name and their kids' birthdays. But Uncle Mel was gone now, and David had been thrust into a world he didn't understand, managing businesses he'd never worked in, responsible for people he'd never met. His MBA from Northwestern had prepared him for spreadsheets and profit margins, not for the human cost of those numbers. When the quarterly reports came in showing Mel's diner operating at a loss, his board of directors had been unanimous in their recommendation: close it down, sell the property, cut their losses. But something had nagged at David. Maybe it was the way his uncle had always spoken about his people at the diner. Maybe it was the guilt of inheriting something he hadn't earned. Or maybe it was just that he'd never actually seen the place where 23 people earned their living under his name. So he'd started coming in, anonymously, watching from booth 7 with his gray sweater and his carefully practiced anonymity. What he'd found had shattered every assumption he'd carried through the door. Maria approached his table, the familiar tray balanced precariously. Up close, he could see the lines of fatigue etched around her eyes, the careful way she held her injured arm, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of more than just physical pain. "More coffee, hun?" she asked, the endearment worn smooth by repetition but still carrying a warmth that seemed genuine despite everything. "Please," David said, studying her face as she poured. "How's the arm doing?" The question caught her off guard. Most customers didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't care. "Oh, it's coming along. Thank you for asking. How did it happen?" Maria hesitated, the coffee pot hovering over his cup. In 2 weeks, this was the most he'd spoken to her. "Car accident," she said finally. "Other driver ran a red light." What she didn't say, that the other driver had been uninsured. That her own insurance had covered the emergency room visit but not the follow-up care. That the physical therapy she needed was $200 a session she couldn't afford. That the cast was supposed to have been replaced with a better one weeks ago, but the original would have to do. What she didn't say, that she'd been on her way home from her second job that night, the one cleaning offices from midnight to 4 a.m., because even full-time hours at Mel's weren't enough to cover rent and groceries and her daughter's school supplies. "That's tough," David said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "Must be hard, working with an injury like that." "You do what you have to do," Maria said, the automatic response of someone who'd never had the luxury of doing anything else. David watched her walk away, noting the slight hitch in her step, the way she paused to steady herself against table 4 before continuing to the kitchen. He pulled out his phone and opened the employee files his HR department had sent him. Maria Santos, 34, employed for 6 years. No disciplinary actions, consistently positive customer feedback, single mother, 1 dependent. The file didn't mention that she'd never missed a day of work, even after the accident. It didn't mention that she'd trained 3 new servers in the past year, patiently teaching them the ropes even though training wasn't part of her job description. It didn't mention that she always volunteered to cover shifts for coworkers with sick children, even when she could barely afford to miss the hours herself. David looked around the diner with new eyes. Really looked. for perhaps the first time. There was Frank, the short order cook, 58 years old and diabetic, who'd been with the diner for 15 years. The employee file said he'd had 3 sick days in the past year. What it didn't say was that Frank had been rationing his insulin, trying to make each vial last longer than it should, because his wife's cancer treatments had eaten through their savings and their insurance had a deductible that might as well have been Mount Everest. There was Janet, the other waitress, 26 and working 2 jobs to put herself through community college. Her file showed excellent performance but didn't capture the way she studied during her breaks, hunched over textbooks with a highlighter, chasing a nursing degree 1 credit hour at a time. There was Bobby, the busboy, 19 and saving every penny for his younger sister's college fund because their parents had died in a factory accident 2 years ago and he'd become her guardian overnight. These weren't just names on a payroll. They were people carrying invisible weights, fighting battles that would never show up in quarterly reports. David's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. They want your recommendation on the diner closures. He stared at the message, then at Maria as she delivered food to table 12, her smile genuine despite the pain he could now see she was hiding. She laughed at something the customer said, and for a moment, her face lit up with real joy. More pie, she asked when she returned to his table. Actually, David said, making a decision that would change everything, I was wondering if you had a few minutes to talk. Maria glanced around the nearly empty diner. I suppose. Is everything okay? David gestured to the seat across from him. Please, sit. There's something I need to tell you. She slid into the booth, wariness replacing the warmth in her expression. If this is about my arm affecting my work. It's not, David said quickly. Well, not in the way you think. He took a breath. My name is David Kellerman. I own this place. The color drained from Maria's face. Oh God, you're here to fire me, aren't you? Because of the accident, because I'm not as fast as I used to be. No, David said firmly. I'm here because I needed to understand something. My board wants me to close this place down. Says it's not profitable enough. Maria's hands began to shake. Please, she whispered. I know I'm not perfect right now, but this job, it's everything. My daughter, she starts high school next year, and I've been saving for her books and. Maria, David said gently. I'm not closing the diner. She stopped mid-sentence, confusion replacing panic. You're not. No. In fact, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure this place not only stays open but thrives. He leaned forward. But I need your help to do it right. Over the next hour, David learned more about running a restaurant than his MBA had ever taught him. He learned that the espresso machine had been broken for 3 months, forcing customers to settle for regular coffee and taking away the profit margin on specialty drinks. He learned that the freezer was on its last legs, forcing them to order smaller quantities of food more frequently at higher prices. He learned that Maria had been coming in early and staying late, not for overtime pay, which the budget couldn't afford, but to prep vegetables and clean equipment because they were short-staffed and she couldn't bear to see the place fall apart. Why didn't anyone tell me about these problems? David asked. Maria looked at him as if he'd asked why fish swim. Tell you, we didn't even know you existed until 5 minutes ago. The last owner, Mr. Mel, he died, and then there were just forms and paperwork and people in suits who talked about operational efficiency. David felt a sharp pang of guilt. While he'd been looking at spreadsheets, these people had been holding the place together with determination and duct tape. What would you need? He asked. If you could fix everything, what would it take? Maria's eyes widened. You're serious. Dead serious. For the next 20 minutes, she outlined a vision that was both practical and passionate. New equipment, yes, but also better training programs, employee benefits that actually helped, a maintenance schedule that prevented problems instead of just reacting to them. She talked about the regular customers who'd been coming for decades, about the community role the diner played, about the late-night haven it provided for truckers and third-shift workers. We could do a breakfast special for the construction crews that start early, she said, her excitement building. And maybe partner with the high school for fundraisers. Janet has all these ideas about social media marketing. She's really good with that stuff. David found himself taking notes, not on profit margins and cost reductions, but on human potential and community value. There's something else, Maria said, her voice quieter now. About my arm. What about it? The doctor says I need physical therapy. Says without it, I might never get full mobility back. She looked down at the cast. I can't afford it. My insurance, it's not great. David thought about his board meeting, about the $1 million marketing budgets they approved without blinking, about the executive bonuses that could fund a small country. Consider it covered, he said. I can't accept. It's not charity. It's an investment in one of my best employees. He smiled. Besides, you're going to be busy. I'm promoting you to assistant manager. Maria stared at him. I don't have a degree or. You have something better. You understand this place and these people. You care about them. David stood up, leaving money for his untouched pie. I'll be back tomorrow to meet with the whole staff. We're going to turn this place around, and we're going to do it right. As he walked toward the door, Maria called after him. Mr. Kellerman. He turned back. Thank you, she said simply. David nodded and stepped out into the afternoon sun, pulling out his phone to call his assistant. Cancel the board meeting, he said. And schedule one for tomorrow instead. Tell them we're not closing Mel's Diner. We're investing in it. Sir, the numbers don't. The numbers don't tell the whole story, David said, watching through the window as Maria stood up from the booth, her posture straighter than he'd ever seen it. Sometimes the most important things can't be measured in spreadsheets. 6 months later, Mel's Diner was not only profitable but thriving. The new espresso machine had brought back the specialty coffee crowd. The fresh equipment had improved efficiency and reduced waste. But more importantly, the investment in people had paid dividends that no financial projection could have predicted. Maria's arm had healed completely, thanks to the physical therapy David had arranged. As assistant manager, she'd implemented training programs that reduced turnover and improved service. Her daughter had started high school with all the books and supplies she needed, plus a college fund that grew a little each month. Frank's diabetes was under control now, thanks to the employee health plan David had negotiated. Janet had finished her nursing degree and stayed on part-time while starting her new career. Bobby's sister had gotten into college with a scholarship, knowing her brother had a stable job to fall back on. David still came in regularly, but now he sat at different tables, talking with customers and staff, understanding the rhythm of the place he'd inherited and chosen to nurture. On a Tuesday afternoon 6 months later, almost exactly a year after his first anonymous visit, David sat in booth 7 with his quarterly reports. The numbers were good, better than good. But what made him smile wasn't the profit margin. It was watching Maria train a new server, patiently showing her how to balance a heavy tray, sharing the techniques she'd learned through necessity and perfected through care. It was seeing Frank joke with customers while he worked, no longer carrying the weight of impossible choices. It was witnessing a community hub humming with life and laughter, serving more than just food, serving hope. His phone buzzed with a text from his board chair. Excellent quarterly numbers on the diner. How did you turn it around? David looked up from his phone at Maria, who was now approaching his table with a fresh pot of coffee and a smile that reached her eyes. How's the coffee today, boss? She asked, the teasing tone they'd developed over months of working together. Perfect, David said, and meant it in more ways than one. He typed his response to the board chair. We invested in people instead of just profits. Turns out they're not mutually exclusive. As Maria walked away to tend to other customers, David reflected on the lesson his Uncle Mel had tried to teach him through his will, that the true value of a business wasn't found in its books but in the lives it touched and the community it served. Sometimes the most important transformations began not with grand gestures or corporate strategies, but with simply taking the time to see, really see, the people behind the numbers, the stories behind the statistics, the humanity behind the bottom line. And sometimes, the best investment you could make was in recognizing that every person carrying a tray, flipping a burger, or wiping down a table was carrying dreams, struggles, and possibilities that deserved respect, support, and the chance to flourish. In the end, saving Mel's Diner hadn't been about the diner at all. It had been about understanding that behind every uniform was a person worthy of dignity, opportunity, and hope. And that understanding, David had learned, was the foundation not just of good business, but of a good life.